acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our hope. Amen. Imagine that you're Catherine Hankey and you sat down and you thought to yourself, hey, I have an awesome new idea to write a new hymn about how great the stories in the Bible are. I'm going to call it, Tell Me the Old Story. And you write this hymn, and everyone loves it, and it becomes a favorite, a classic. And then, 100 and something years later, people start to refer to it as that old hymn that ironically is about the old story. And people start to use it less because it's one of them old hymns, want to have something cooler, more contemporary, more hip. So it's not new anymore. It's just an old hymn. Tell me the old story. How often do we do that with the stories, though, with the Bible? It's not like we haven't heard this story before. Oh, good Lord, how many times do we have to listen to him talk about this story? How many times have we heard that? Let's just go with a lot and leave it at that. The point is that, yes, the story's old. It's very old. That hymn actually is very old, too. But it tells a really important truth. However old the story is, it's still going to be new to somebody. In fact, the best time that it's new to somebody, I think, is when you think you know the story. And then suddenly, it becomes something new again. Marcus Borg, and I think there's now, he had 2 books that have Again for the First Time in the title. Meeting Jesus, Again for the First Time. I think there's a Bible one too. And that what a great way to look at that. Again for the first time. It's not like we haven't been there before. We sure have. In fact, Mary and Martha would definitely be in the category, kind of like the Good Samaritan. We've started to use it, right? Even if you haven't read the Bible, you might recognize if somebody's a Martha, especially if you've read The Handmaid's Tale, you understand what a Martha is. It's somebody who works all the time. And by the way, Mary's the one who made the right choice. But that's only if you've heard somebody's their particular take on, or their particular understanding of that story. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure, like from the very beginning. In fact, you know what? I wonder, this is one of those moments where maybe you just have to kind of begin with a few questions. Begin with a question like, who's this story for? Why did the author of Luke include this story in the first place? It's not even a story, it's a vignette. Jesus stopped in a village, visits with Mary and Martha. It's not particularly clear whether there was a crowd there or not, or whether it was just Jesus. In all likelihood, it would not have been just Jesus because, single guy, 2 women, you know what I'm saying? But then again, you might also want to ask, how did Mary and Martha happen to own their own place? But then it kind of depends, again, on which version of this story you've read, because there are some versions that imply that it was at their house, and others that don't include that, where it just kind of implies it's in the town, and maybe it was Mary and Martha just do it. Starts to get a little fuzzier, doesn't it? Particularly if you begin with that question of why do you include the story? Is this a story that's for you to learn from? Actually, either way, I think the answer to that is yes. But is this a story that is to benefit you, or is this a story that is to benefit the person telling the story? I mean, let's think about this for a moment. If I'm a pastor, a story that says whatever you think is important isn't nearly as important as what I have to say to you on Sunday morning. Of course, if we all believe that, the place would be full. But Maybe that's why Luke included it. Maybe Luke, the author of Luke, included this story so that you would come to understand the importance of the stories you were hearing around it. Because not everybody did, right? Jesus would stop and talk to a crowd, or he'd stop and talk in a town. Some people would come and listen, and some people would come and listen and go, ooh, this is great stuff. I love that. Some people would come and listen and go, I don't know. Some people would just kind of, oh, it's that Jesus guy? No, and leave. And other people probably had no idea he was even there. Not everyone heard the story right away. And that means because they didn't hear the story right away, they might have heard other people's versions of the story. Why is this story here? I don't for a moment think that I want this story. I'm not saying it isn't, but I don't want this story to be about whatever you think is important, it's not as important as Jesus. That's not the Jesus I know. But I do also think that there's more to this story than simply either you're Mary or you're Martha. And I think for a very long time we've made it that simple. Pick one and choose a side. And don't forget, I've already told you what's the right side. But then again, what about the old Protestant work ethic? That's Martha, isn't it? Isn't that Martha? And wait a minute, isn't she the one who's, is this story really about taking sides, or is it about how we need both of those pieces? Look at Jesus' life. Not just in this moment, but look at the whole story. In fact, look at other people's version of this story, the other Gospels. Look at the stories that are told about the stories. Nowhere in there does it say Jesus did nothing, he just sat and talked to people. Nowhere does it say Jesus kept telling people to leave him alone because now is his spiritual time for himself. In fact, the stories are about how he tried to get away from people to find time for himself and was not very successful at that. Jesus is a Martha. No, I think it's both. I think it's both. In fact, I can see, let me tell the story a little differently. Here's a different version of the story, and it won't involve any politicians or popes this week. Let me tell the story a little differently. Jesus comes to a village where he meets Martha and Mary. And while Mary sits at his feet and listens to him talk, Martha busies herself with all of the important things that are such an important piece of hospitality, which is such an important piece of Hebrew people in the day. And Mary says to Jesus, Jesus, I love what you're saying, and I'm really trying hard to pay attention, but Martha's so busy, it's really annoying me, and I'm finding it hard to concentrate. Could you please tell her to stop? What do you think Jesus' answer to that is? Is it, yes, you're absolutely right? Martha, sit down. Or is it, well, you know what, Mary? Martha's doing important work. It's important stuff. You're listening to me now, and maybe she'll have time later, but even if she doesn't, you know what? You should share what I'm telling you with her. Her work isn't any less important. In fact, Mary, you might want to get up and do a few things later. You might want to clean up the dishes after, maybe do the dishes, put them away, clean up afterwards. We need both pieces. There must be a time for quiet and Sabbath. I was about to say quiet and rest, but I don't mean that. I mean Sabbath. There always needs to be time for rest, yes. But Sabbath, quite specifically, isn't just a day of rest. It's a day that you set aside all of the things that you do every other day in order that you take that one day not just to rest, but to work on your relationship with God. That's the point of Sabbath, I think. It's not just to sit around. Mary's having a bit of a Sabbath moment. She's listening to Jesus. She's learning. She's working on her relationship with God. Right in this moment, Martha is also working on her relationship with God because she's doing work. And if we cannot see the presence of God in the things that we do, I think we missed something. Because God isn't just about sitting quietly in church on a Sunday morning, listening to the pastor say really important, eloquent things that you're going to take away with you. It's also about living all of those things. I'm a little bit disturbed that nobody even cracked a smile at eloquent things that the pastor has to say. Makes me feel a little bit like you might actually either believe that or absolutely don't. It's both things. We need the moments for spiritual reflection and refreshment. We need the moments to learn. We need the moments to work solely on our relationship with God, but we need also the work of sharing that with others. We need also the work of creating the kingdom of God here. That's literally the life of Jesus. Both of those things. And I keep saying both like there's only two aspects of that, but of course there's a multiplicity of aspects of those things, right? Caring for the poor, healing the sick. Justice, a word we don't use nearly often enough when we talk about doing the work of God in the community and in the world. Stewardship. Those are all work words. It's not just about sitting and listening. It's about the doing part too. It would be really super useful to have a story where Jesus says, it's really important that you set aside whatever else you think is important in order to listen to the good news. But wouldn't that just be like saying, there's a commandment that says we get a day off, and not understanding how that might relate to the other 6 days? We need to connect the two things. There needs to be time for both, and sometimes there's an opportunity to integrate those things. I'm going to go with almost always. There is a time to integrate those things. It's not just about listening to the word. It's not just about learning. It's not just about doing. It's about finding the balance of those things in our lives. That's how we make the kingdom come here. I think I have to want to believe it, and it is entirely possible this story was included so that you would understand that you're supposed to stop and listen to me. But I really desperately want to think that the person who wrote the Gospel of Luke included this story, this vignette of like 5 verses, whatever it is, this super short little thing, just as a way of opening the door on that conversation. Of not just, yes, there must be time for both, but how do we do both? How do we take what we learn, what we hear, what we know in the good news, and bring it into the world?